However, if you got your money from investors and owners, okay, which is equity, if you get your money from investors and owners and they expect a 10% return or 10% profit, then your cost of capital is also 10%. Okay? So what is the cost of capital? It depends on whether you got it from debt or equity. If you get it from debt, then your cost of capital is the same as the cost of debt. If you got your capital from equity, then your cost of capital is the same as your cost of equity, or from the expected return of your investors. So that is how simple it is. Okay? Very simple, right? It is very simple. But now, what if, okay, what if your capital comes from a combination? So here, we talk about how your capital comes from either debt or equity, right? But what if it comes from a combination of both? Alright? What if your capital comes from, part of your capital comes from debt, and part of your capital comes from equity? Alright? What is the cost of debt now? Now, you remember now this 60% here. So yeah, let's pretend that part of it comes from debt and part of it comes from equity, and more of the capital, or 60%, comes from debt, and less of the capital, or 40%, comes from equity. Alright? How do we now know the cost of capital? Okay. Now remember, the cost of debt, or the bank borrowing interest rate, is 5%. And remember, the expected return of the owners or investors is 10%. So now we ask ourselves, is it 5% or 10%? Oh, and one more piece of information that I'm going to add now is that the tax rate of your company is 35%. Alright? Now, I know now you might be surprised. Oh my God, where did this 35% come from? Okay, don't worry, because for sure, in your problem with your professor, this will be given. Okay? And I know you're also wondering, why am I even talking about this 35% tax rate now? Okay? Well, you will see in a while. In a short while, you will see why I mentioned this. So right now, you still cannot see why, or you still cannot understand why I'm talking about this 35%. But you will see in a while, in a short while. So just hold on a second and don't worry too much about it. So anyway, the question now is, oh yeah, don't confuse the percentages. You have to realize and remember that this 60% talks about how the debt is 60% of the entire capital. Alright? And this 5% is the same as the bank interest rate. And this 35% is the same as the government tax rate on your company, which is the corporate tax rate. Okay? Do not get confused with these three. You should always know the difference of these three, or else you will get confused later on when I show you the formula. So remember the differences of these three, and remember the differences of these two. over here. So 10% is the expected return of the investors, expected profit of the investors, and 40% is the proportion, or how much is the equity compared to the total capital. Alright? Now we move on. So the important question here is, what is the cost of capital now? Is it 5% or is it 10%? Okay? Remember, if your capital comes from debt, then the cost of capital is 5%. But if your capital comes from equity, then the cost of capital is 10%. But in this case, your capital is a combination of both debt and equity. And your capital is composed of more debt, or 60%, and less equity, or 40%. So now, what is your cost of capital? 5% or 10%? And the answer to that is, it is a combination of both 5% and 10%. However, right now, we still do not know exactly how much it is of this combination. Is it 5.5%? Is it 6%? Is it 7%? Is it 8%? Or is it 9%? Or something else? Okay, now, in order to find out the exact combination percentage of the cost of capital, we now use the formula of the weighted average cost of capital. Now, don't panic when I show it to you. It looks complicated, but it is actually very simple after I explain it. Okay, so here it is. Whoa, look at that. Scary. What a scary formula. Well, it's actually very simple, and I'll show you right now. This D over V, now, your professor might use different letters instead of these. You know, different professors use different letters, and that's very funny, I know. But it means practically the same thing. Now, how do you use this formula? Simple. This D over V talks about the proportion of debt. So, it's this 60% here goes here. This cost of debt, or 5%, is the same as the rate of debt over here. And this TC over here talks about the tax rate, which we already know, which is given as 35%. And that goes here. As for the cost of equity, well, it's similar. This E over V over here talks about the proportion of equity, which is the same as this over here. And this RE over here, R sub E, talks about the rate of return expected by the owners, which we already know to be 10%. You see? Simple. And if we plug all these percentages in, it will look like this. Ta-da! See? It's not so difficult. Not so complicated after all. Now, if we translate this into mathematical format, it will look like this. Alright? So 60% is 0.60, 5% is 0.05, 35% is 0.35, And remember to add the 1 over here. It's 1 minus 35, and here it's 1 minus 0.35. And 40% is written as 0.40, and 10% is written as 0.10. Simple as that. Okay? Now, you might be wondering, why is there a minus 35%? Why do we have to think about the tax rate? Okay? Why don't we just use the debt and the interest rate, and then use the equity or the owner's investment and the cost of ownership? Why do we need to know this? Well, that's because when you pay interest to the bank, the government allows you to write that down as an expense. Okay? As an expense. And when you have an expense, what does that do? When you write that down as an expense, then that actually lowers your taxes. So expenses are bad because it costs you money, but it's actually not so bad. It's actually not very bad because it also lowers your taxes. So this 35% here, okay, so you're wondering, why is it minus 35%? Because this minus 35% represents the discount that you will get on your taxes because of this expense. Alright? It's as simple as that. But if you don't understand that, then don't worry so much about it. Just believe me when I tell you that you should add this part to the debt side or the debt area of the equation. Alright. Anyway, if we add and multiply all these things together, we will find that the weighted average cost of capital is 0.0595 or 5.95%. So there we have it. We knew that the cost of capital was a combination of somewhere in between 5% and 10%. But we did not know yet exactly how much. But now we know exactly how much it is. And that is 5.95%. Alright. Next, don't stop there. Wait, don't shut off the video yet. It's not enough to know this. It's very important to know, how do we use the WACC, or the weighted average cost of capital? We already know that it's 5.95%. Well, so what? How do we use it? Well, 5.95% represents how much it costs your money, it costs your business or your company to get money. And so we now compare it. Let's just, as an example, let's just say that your company has a proposed new project. Okay, so let's say this is you over here, or your manager, and you're thinking about whether or not to do this new project. Okay, and let's give an example that you estimate that this project will earn a rate of return of 4%. Okay? Let's say it will earn a rate of return of 4%. Now, will you do this project or not? The answer is no. You should not do this project, because if your weighted average cost of capital is 5.95% and you earn only 4%, then that means that your company is losing 1.95%. You see, it's as simple as that. However, if you estimate or predict that your company or your project or your company will earn a rate of return of 8%, should you do this project or not? And the answer is yes. Why? Because if your weighted average cost of capital is only 5.95%, but you're earning a rate of return of 8%, then that means you make a profit of 2.5%. You see? That's as simple as that. And that is how you use the WACC. Now, very important reminder. You only use the WACC formula or the WACC concept if your company has both equity and debt. Alright? Now, why am I saying this? Because in simpler problems, okay? In simpler problems, your professor might not give you the cost of equity, and he might not give you enough information to compute the cost of equity, and instead he only gives you the cost of debt, or he only gives you the bank interest rate. Now, in that case, you compare your rate of return only to the interest rate of the bank and not to WACC, which is here. Okay? So remember, you only use this WACC, weighted average cost of capital, if the company has both equity and debt. Alright? So now that you understand the basic concept of the WACC, or the weighted average cost of capital, you're now ready for my next video on exam training, because this video was just a very simple example and it is not enough for you to pass your exams or to get a high grade in your exams. So check out my next video for exam training. Alright, so please share it if you like it. On Twitter, my nickname is MBA Bullshit, and another way you can share it is to please share my YouTube link on your Facebook to your other friends who might be interested, whether they're students or business executives or whatever. Alright, so thanks and have a nice day. Have a great day. Take care. Goodbye.